Woman refuses to sit next to old man on flight. Then she learns who he is. The bustling airport terminal pulsed with the frenetic energy of a typical Monday morning. Streams of travelers flowed through the concourse, their rolling luggage creating a percussive symphony against the polished floors. Amidst this controlled chaos, Claire Everett strode purposefully toward her gate, her designer heels clicking a staccato rhythm that matched her determined pace. At 35, Claire exuded an aura of polished professionalism. Her tailored charcoal suit spoke of boardrooms and corner offices, while her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and subtle makeup suggested a woman who valued appearance as much as ability. As she navigated the crowded terminal, her sharp blue eyes remained fixed on her smartphone, fingers flying across the screen as she fired off last-minute emails before her flight. This business trip to Chicago was crucial. Claire had spent weeks preparing for the merger negotiations that awaited her, and her mind was already racing through potential scenarios and strategies. As she approached the gate, she tucked her phone into her designer handbag and retrieved her boarding pass, barely glancing at the gate agent as she scanned it and made her way down the jet bridge. The narrow aisle of the Boeing 737 felt even more claustrophobic than usual as Claire inched her way toward her assigned seat in economy class. She silently cursed her company's new cost-cutting measures that had downgraded her usual business class ticket. As she approached row 23, her eyes quickly scanned for her seat, 23B. That's when she saw him. Occupying the window seat was an elderly man who seemed to have seen better days. His weathered face bore the lines of countless years, each wrinkle a testament to a life lived fully. The man's attire was simple and slightly worn, a faded plaid shirt tucked into khaki pants that had clearly seen many washes. Atop his wispy white hair sat a navy blue cap, adorned with a military insignia that Claire couldn't quite make out. As Claire approached, the old man looked up, his rheumy eyes crinkling at the corners as he offered her a gentle smile. His hands, resting on the armrests, trembled slightly, whether from age or nervousness. Claire couldn't tell. There was something in his posture, a slight stoop to his shoulders, that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and perhaps heavy burdens carried. Claire felt a wave of irritation wash over her. This was not what she needed today. She had planned to use the flight time to review her notes and prepare for the upcoming negotiations. The last thing she wanted was to be stuck next to someone who might require assistance or, worse, try to engage her in conversation for the entire flight. Without acknowledging the old man's smile, Claire quickly glanced around the cabin, hoping to spot an empty row or at least a seat next to someone who looked less likely to be a distraction. Finding none immediately visible, she made a split-second decision. Turning on her heel, Claire marched back up the aisle toward the front of the plane, her carry-on bag trailing behind her. She approached a flight attendant who was assisting another passenger with storing luggage in the overhead bin. "Excuse me," Claire said, her voice low but firm. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s with a practiced smile, turned to face her. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Claire leaned in slightly, conscious of the other passengers boarding around them. "I was wondering if there might be another seat available. I'd prefer to sit somewhere else if possible." The flight attendant's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. "Is there a problem with your assigned seat? If it's a medical issue, we can certainly try to accommodate you." "No medical issue," Claire replied quickly, feeling a twinge of embarrassment but pressing on nonetheless. "I'd just prefer a different seat if one's available." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but her professional demeanor never wavered. "Let me check our seating chart. One moment, please." As the attendant consulted her tablet, Claire felt a mixture of relief and guilt wash over her. She knew she was being unreasonable, perhaps even unkind, but the thought of spending the next few hours next to the elderly man filled her with an irrational sense of dread. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute or two, the flight attendant looked up. "We do have a seat available in row 28. It's also an aisle seat. Would that be acceptable?" Claire nodded, relief evident in her voice. "Yes, that would be perfect. Thank you." As she made her way back down the aisle to her new seat, Claire deliberately avoided looking toward row 23. She didn't want to see the old man's face. Didn't want to confront the possibility that he might have noticed her request to move. It was easier this way, she told herself. Better for everyone involved. Settling into her new seat, Claire let out a small sigh of relief. She was now seated next to a young woman engrossed in a novel and a middle-aged man already dozing against the window. Perfect. No distractions, no potential neediness. Just the peace and quiet she needed to focus on her work. As the last passengers boarded and the flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, Claire pulled out her laptop and a stack of documents. She had just under 2 hours to review the latest financial projections and refine her negotiation strategy. With a determined set to her jaw, she immersed herself in her work, the elderly man in row 23 already fading from her thoughts. Little did Claire know that her simple act of judgment and avoidance would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge her perceptions, humble her spirit, and ultimately lead to a profound lesson in the dangers of making assumptions about others. As the plane taxied down the runway, its engines roaring to life, Claire felt the familiar surge of acceleration press her back into her seat. She barely registered the takeoff, her attention wholly consumed by the spreadsheet open on her laptop. The numbers danced before her eyes, each cell a piece of the complex puzzle she was trying to solve before landing in Chicago. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin filled with the rustle of passengers adjusting in their seats, reaching for bags, and settling in for the journey. Claire remained oblivious to it all, her manicured fingers flying across the keyboard as she updated projections and tweaked formulas. Several rows ahead, Walter sat quietly by the window, his gnarled hands resting lightly on his lap. Unlike many of the passengers around him who were eagerly pulling out books, tablets, or headphones, Walter seemed content to simply be. His pale blue eyes, though clouded with age, held a clarity of purpose as they gazed out at the patchwork landscape below. The worn duffel bag at his feet held more than just a change of clothes and toiletries. Hidden within its faded canvas confines was a small wooden box, lovingly crafted and weathered by time. Inside that box lay a medal, a simple star hanging from a light blue ribbon that told a story of valor, sacrifice, and a lifetime of quiet heroism. As the flight progressed, Claire occasionally glanced up from her work, her eyes inadvertently drawn to the back of Walter's head several rows ahead. Each time, she felt a tiny prick of guilt, quickly pushed aside as she refocused on her task at hand. She rationalized her decision to move, telling herself that she had done what was best for her work, for the company. After all, wasn't that why she was on this flight in the first place? The young woman next to Claire had dozed off, her novel forgotten in her lap. On Claire's other side, the middle-aged man continued to sleep, his soft snores barely audible over the ambient noise of the aircraft. It was exactly the environment Claire had hoped for: quiet, undisturbed, conducive to concentration. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, Claire found her thoughts periodically drifting. She caught herself wondering about the old man, about the story behind his military cap, about the life he might have lived. Each time, she would shake off these musings, chiding herself for getting distracted. She had made her choice, and there was no point in second-guessing it now. Meanwhile, Walter's presence in row 23 had not gone entirely unnoticed by the other passengers. A young mother across the aisle smiled warmly at him as she bounced a fussy infant on her knee. The businessman in the aisle seat next to Walter offered a polite nod when he returned from the lavatory. These small gestures of acknowledgement were met with Walter's gentle smile and a quiet nod of his own. As the drink service began, the flight attendants made their way down the aisle with their carts. When they reached Walter's row, the attendant who had helped Claire earlier paused, her eyes lingering on the military insignia on Walter's cap. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said warmly, her voice carrying just far enough for Claire to overhear. "What can I get for you to drink today?" Walter looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes at being addressed directly. "Just water, please," he replied, his voice soft but clear. "Thank you kindly." The flight attendant's smile widened as she poured his water. "It's our pleasure. Please let us know if you need anything else during the flight." As the cart moved on, Claire found herself straining to hear more, curiosity getting the better of her professional focus, but Walter had lapsed back into silence. His eyes once again turned to the window, lost in thought or memory. The flight continued, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to the muted conversations and rustling movements of the passengers. Claire tried to immerse herself once more in her work, but she found her concentration wavering. Her eyes kept drifting towards row 23, her mind conjuring questions she hadn't thought to ask earlier. What branch of the military had Walter served in? How long ago? Had he seen combat? The questions swirled in her mind, competing with profit margins and market projections for her attention. As if sensing her unspoken curiosity, the universe conspired to provide answers. A young man sitting across the aisle from Walter, who had been engrossed in a book for most of the flight, suddenly looked up. His gaze fell on Walter's cap, and a spark of interest lit his eyes, his voice soft but clear. Many years ago now. The young man's face lit up with interest. Wow, that's amazing. Do you mind if I ask which branch? As Walter began to respond, Claire found herself leaning forward slightly, her work forgotten, as she strained to hear the conversation unfolding several rows ahead. Little did she know that this seemingly casual exchange was about to open a window into a world of heroism and sacrifice that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the unassuming old man she had so quickly dismissed. The gentle hum of the airplane's engines provided a soothing backdrop as the conversation between Walter and the young man, who had introduced himself as David, began to unfold. Claire, despite her best efforts to focus on her work, found her attention inexorably drawn to their exchange. She tried to convince herself that she was simply overhearing by chance, but deep down, she knew she was intentionally eavesdropping. "I served in the army," Walter was saying, his voice carrying a hint of pride beneath its soft tone. "Infantry, it was a different world back then." David leaned in, clearly fascinated. "Was this during World War II?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and reverence. Walter nodded, a faraway look coming into his eyes. "Yes, I was part of the 101st Airborne Division. We saw action in some of the toughest battles of the war." At the mention of the 101st Airborne, Claire's ears perked up even more. She vaguely remembered learning about this unit in her high school history class, the Screaming Eagles, they were called. Known for their bravery and tenacity, they had played crucial roles in some of the most significant operations of the war. "The 101st Airborne?" David echoed, clearly impressed. "I've read about them. You guys were involved in D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, right?" A shadow passed over Walter's face at the mention of these battles, a flicker of old pain that was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "That's right," he confirmed. "Normandy, Market Garden, Bastogne. We were there for it all." Claire found herself leaning slightly into the aisle, straining to catch every word. Her laptop lay forgotten on her tray table, the figures and projections that had seemed so vital just moments ago now feeling trivial in comparison to the living history unfolding a few rows ahead. David, sensing the weight of Walter's memories, spoke softly. "It must have been incredibly difficult. I can't even imagine what you went through." Walter was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the window. When he spoke again, his voice was tinged with a mixture of sadness and pride. "It was hard, yes. We lost a lot of good men. But we also forged bonds that have lasted a lifetime. The men I served with, they became more than friends. They were brothers." As Walter spoke, Claire felt a lump forming in her throat. She thought about her own battles, corporate takeovers, market fluctuations, quarterly reports, and suddenly they seemed so insignificant compared to what this man had endured. "Were you involved in any particularly dangerous operations?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid to probe too deeply into Walter's memories. Walter nodded slowly. "We were part of Operation Market Garden," he said, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he was seeing not the clouds outside the plane's window, but the war-torn landscapes of his youth. "It was one of the largest airborne operations in history. We were dropped behind enemy lines in the Netherlands. The goal was to secure a series of bridges to open a route into Germany. Claire found herself holding her breath, completely engrossed in Walter's story. She had never heard a first-hand account of these historical events before, and the reality of it, coming from this unassuming old man she had so quickly dismissed, was hitting her hard. "What happened?" David asked, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the plane. Walter sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "It didn't go as planned. We faced much stronger resistance than expected. Many of us didn't make it back. Those were dark days." The plane cabin suddenly felt very quiet to Claire. She looked around and realized that other passengers nearby had also tuned into the conversation, their faces a mixture of awe and somber respect. David, clearly moved by Walter's words, hesitated before asking his next question. Did you receive any commendations for your service?" At this, Walter fell silent for a long moment. Claire found herself leaning even further into the aisle, her heart pounding with anticipation. When Walter finally spoke, his voice was so soft that Claire had to strain to hear him. "I did," he said, almost reluctantly. "I was awarded the Medal of Honor." The words hung in the air, their significance seeming to alter the very atmosphere of the plane. Claire felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the cabin. The Medal of Honor. She knew what that meant. It was the highest and most prestigious military decoration in the United States, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. And she had asked to move seats to avoid sitting next to this man. The realization hit Claire like a physical blow. She slumped back in her seat, her mind reeling. The elderly man she had dismissed as a potential nuisance was, in fact, a genuine hero. Someone who had risked his life, who had likely seen and done things she couldn't even imagine, all in service to his country. As the magnitude of her misjudgment washed over her, Claire felt a deep sense of shame begin to take root. She had based her entire impression of Walter on a quick glance and a set of misguided assumptions. How many other times had she done this in her life? How many other heroes or remarkable individuals had she overlooked or dismissed based on superficial? The revelation of Walter's Medal of Honor sent a ripple of astonishment through the nearby passengers. Claire, still reeling from the shock, noticed that others had stopped their activities to listen. A businessman, 2 rows ahead, removed his headphones. A mother hushed her chattering child, all straining to hear more of Walter's extraordinary story. David, the young man who had initiated the conversation, sat in stunned silence for a moment before finding his voice again. "The Medal of Honor," he repeated, his tone a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Sir, that's incredible. If you don't mind me asking, what did you do to receive such a high honor?" Walter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his weathered hands fidgeting with the brim of his cap. It was clear that despite the passage of time, the memories associated with his award were still vivid and perhaps painful. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he was speaking to himself rather than to David or the now attentive passengers around him. "It was during the Battle of the Bulge," Walter began, his eyes taking on a faraway look. December 1944. The Germans had launched a massive counter-offensive, and we were caught off guard. The weather was brutal, freezing cold, snow everywhere. We were surrounded, cut off from supplies, running low on ammunition and food. Claire found herself leaning forward again, her laptop long forgotten. She could almost see the scene Walter was describing. Young soldiers, not much older than boys really, huddled in frozen foxholes, their breath misting in the frigid air as enemy forces closed in around them. Walter continued, his voice growing stronger as he delved deeper into his memories. Our position was being hammered by artillery. We'd already lost a lot of men, and those of us left were starting to lose hope. That's when we got word that a group of our guys were pinned down about half a mile away. They were taking heavy fire and couldn't move. The cabin of the plane was now completely silent, save for the constant hum of the engines. Even the flight attendants had paused in their duties, standing quietly at the edges of the aisle, listening intently. "Someone had to go help them," Walter said, his voice catching slightly. I volunteered to lead a small team. We knew it was risky, but we couldn't just leave our buddies out there to die. David nodded encouragingly, his eyes wide with anticipation. What happened next, my sir? Walter took a deep breath, his hands now clasped tightly in his lap. We made our way through the snow, trying to stay low and out of sight. The enemy fire was intense, bullets whizzing past our heads, mortars exploding all around us. We lost 2 men before we even reached our pinned-down comrades. Claire felt a chill run down her spine, goosebumps rising on her arms despite the warm cabin air. She tried to imagine the scene, the chaos, the fear, the deafening noise of battle. It was beyond anything she had ever experienced. When we got there, Walter continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, it was worse than we thought. Half the men were wounded, some critically. We knew we had to get them out fast, but the German fire was relentless. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. I don't remember making a conscious decision. I just acted. I started making runs back and forth, carrying the wounded to safety. Each time I went out, I was sure it would be my last. But somehow, I kept going. A collective gasp went through the listening passengers. Claire felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, her throat tight with emotion. I don't know how many trips I made, Walter said, shaking his head slightly as if in disbelief at his own actions. Everything was a blur of snow and blood and gunfire. I was hit twice, once in the shoulder and once in the leg, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was getting those boys to safety. David, his voice filled with awe, asked softly, How many men did you save? Walter was quiet for a moment, his eyes closed, as if seeing the faces of those long-ago comrades. 11, he finally said. I got 11 men out of that hellhole, but it wasn't just me, the rest of my team. They were heroes too. Some of them didn't make it back. The weight of Walter's words hung heavy in the air. Claire felt a deep sense of humility wash over her. Here was a man who had faced death, who had put his life on the line repeatedly to save others, and she had judged him based on nothing more than his aged appearance. After it was all over, Walter continued, they told me I was being recommended for the Medal of Honor. I didn't feel like a hero. I was just doing what anyone would have done, but they insisted. The ceremony at the White House, meeting the president, it all felt like a dream. As Walter's story came to an end, a profound silence fell over the cabin. It was as if everyone needed a moment to process the magnitude of what they had just heard. Claire looked around, seeing her own emotions reflected on the faces of her fellow passengers. Awe, respect, and more than a few tears. A middle-aged woman across the aisle was the first to break the silence. Thank you for your service, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And thank you for sharing your story with us. Her words seemed to break a dam, and suddenly passengers from all around were echoing the sentiment, their voices a chorus of gratitude and admiration. Walter, looking slightly overwhelmed by the attention, nodded humbly, a faint blush coloring his weathered cheeks. As the buzz of conversation slowly resumed around her, Claire remained frozen in her seat, her mind whirling. She thought about her initial judgment of Walter, her dismissive attitude, her decision to change seats. The shame she felt was almost physical in its intensity. But beyond the shame, Claire felt something else stirring within her, a sense of profound respect and gratitude. Walter's story had touched something deep inside her, challenging her perceptions and reminding her of the dangers of making assumptions about others. As she watched Walter fielding questions and handshakes from admiring passengers, Claire made a decision. She couldn't change her initial actions, but she could make amends. Taking a deep breath, she stood up, straightened her suit jacket, and began making her way towards row 23, her heart pounding with each step. Little did she know that this decision would lead to a conversation that would change her perspective forever, teaching her valuable lessons about humility, respect, and the hidden depths that lie within every person we meet. As Claire made her way towards Walter's seat, she noticed a flurry of activity near the front of the plane. The flight attendant who had helped her change seats earlier was hurrying down the aisle, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. It was clear that word of Walter's remarkable story had reached the cabin crew. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sarah, reached Walter's row just as Claire arrived. For a moment, the two women's eyes met, and Claire saw a flicker of recognition in Sarah's gaze. There was no judgment there, just a shared understanding of the extraordinary situation unfolding before them. Sarah knelt beside Walter's seat, her professional demeanor softening into one of genuine awe and respect. "Sir," she began, her voice gentle but filled with emotion, "I've just been informed about your Medal of Honor. On behalf of our entire crew, I want to express our deepest gratitude for your service and sacrifice." Walter, looking slightly embarrassed by the attention, offered a humble smile. "Thank you, miss, but please, there's no need for any fuss. I'm just an old man on a plane like anyone else." Sarah shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, sir, you're not just anyone else. What you did, it's beyond anything most of us could imagine. Is there anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable? Anything at all?" Claire watched this interaction with a mixture of admiration for Sarah's graceful handling of the situation and a deepening sense of her own misjudgment. She remembered how brusquely she had asked this same flight attendant to move her seat, all to avoid sitting next to the very man who was now being treated with such reverence. Walter, still seeming uncomfortable with the attention, shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm quite all right. Just a glass of water would be fine, if it's not too much trouble." "Of course, sir, right away," Sarah replied, standing up. "And please, don't hesitate to ask if you need anything else during the flight. It's truly an honor to have you on board with us today." As Sarah hurried off to fetch Walter's water, Claire found herself rooted to the spot, uncertain of how to proceed. She had come with the intention of apologizing, of making amends for her earlier behavior, but now, faced with the reality of Walter's heroism and the crew's reverence, she felt woefully inadequate. Walter, noticing her hesitation, looked up at her with kind eyes. "Is everything all right, miss? Did you need something?" His gentle inquiry broke through Claire's paralysis. Taking a deep breath, she stepped closer to his seat. I'm sorry. I don't know your last name," she began, her usually confident voice wavering slightly. "Harding," Walter supplied. "Walter Harding. But please, just call me Walter." "Mr. Harding." "Walter," Claire corrected herself. I owe you an apology. I was the one who asked to move seats earlier. I made a terrible judgment based on nothing but appearances, and I can't tell you how ashamed I am of my behavior." Walter's expression softened, a look of understanding crossing his features. "There's no need for apologies, miss. We all make judgments sometimes. What matters is that we learn from them." Claire felt a lump forming in her throat, touched by Walter's graciousness. "You're very kind to say that, but I still feel terrible. I'd like to make it up to you, if I can. Would you mind if I sat here and talked with you for a while?" A warm smile spread across Walter's face. "I like that very much," he said, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "It's a long flight, and company is always welcome." As Claire settled into the seat, she noticed several nearby passengers watching the interaction with interest. She realized that her gesture, small as it was, might be seen as a form of atonement, a recognition of the error in her initial judgment. Just then, Sarah returned with Walter's water, along with a selection of snacks and a warm blanket. "Here you are, Mr. Harding," she said, arranging the items carefully. "And miss," she added, turning to Claire with a knowing look, "can I get you anything?" Claire shook her head, feeling a rush of gratitude for Sarah's tact. "No, thank you. I'm fine." As Sarah moved away, Claire turned back to Walter, noticing for the first time the details she had overlooked earlier. The quiet strength in his posture despite his age, the glint of wisdom in his eyes, the way his hands, though gnarled with arthritis, still possessed a certain steadiness. "So, Walter," she began, her voice soft with newfound respect, "if you don't mind me asking, what brings you on this flight today?" Walter's eyes lit up, a spark of excitement replacing the earlier discomfort at being the center of attention. "I'm on my way to a reunion," he said, his voice warm with anticipation. Some of the men from my old unit, those who are still with us, that is, we try to get together every few years. It's a chance to remember, to honor those we've lost, and to celebrate the time we have left." As Walter began to share more about his upcoming reunion and the bonds that had lasted a lifetime, Claire found herself drawn into a world she had never known existed. A world of courage, sacrifice, and enduring friendship that transcended the horrors of war. The conversation flowed easily, with Walter sharing stories of his life after the war, his career as a high school history teacher, his marriage to his sweetheart who had waited for him to return from Europe, the children and grandchildren who had brought so much joy to his life. Claire, in turn, opened up about her own life, her driven career in the corporate world, the challenges she faced as a woman in a male-dominated industry, and the recent doubts she'd been having about the path she had chosen. As the flight continued, Claire felt a shift occurring within her. The pressing concerns that had consumed her thoughts earlier, the merger negotiations, the financial projections, began to fade into the background. In their place, a new perspective was taking root, one that valued human connection and humility over professional achievement and snap judgments. The hours passed quickly, filled with laughter, moments of poignant reflection, and the kind of deep, meaningful conversation that so often eludes us in our busy daily lives. Before Claire knew it, the captain's voice was announcing their descent into Chicago. As the plane began its approach, Claire realized that this journey had become about far more than just a business trip. It had become a profound lesson in the dangers of judging others based on appearances, and a powerful reminder of the extraordinary stories that often lie hidden behind ordinary facades. Looking at Walter, who was now gazing out the window at the approaching cityscape, Claire felt a surge of gratitude. This man, whom she had so quickly dismissed, had given her a gift far more valuable than any business deal, a renewed appreciation for the depth and complexity of every human life. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the runway, Claire knew that she was arriving in Chicago, a changed woman. The merger negotiations awaiting her still mattered, of course, but they now seemed to exist in a broader, more nuanced context. She had been reminded of what truly mattered in life, and she was determined to carry this lesson with her long after the flight had ended. Little did Claire know that the most powerful part of her interaction with Walter was yet to come, a moment of connection and understanding that would cement the lessons of this extraordinary flight and change her perspective forever. As the plane taxied to the gate, Claire found herself in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The conversation with Walter had opened her eyes to a world beyond quarterly reports and market shares, a world where true heroism and human connection took center stage. Yet, as the reality of her impending business meeting loomed, she felt the familiar pull of her corporate responsibilities. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began the usual rush to retrieve their belongings and exit the plane. Claire, however, remained seated, her mind racing. She glanced at Walter, who was slowly gathering his worn duffel bag, his movements deliberate and unhurried amidst the flurry of activity around them. "Let me help you with that," Claire offered, reaching for the bag. Walter smiled gratefully, allowing her to lift it from under the seat. As they stood to join the line of departing passengers, Claire felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to continue their conversation, to glean more wisdom from this remarkable man. But the pragmatic voice in her head reminded her of the tight schedule ahead, the cab waiting to whisk her to the hotel, the team of lawyers and executives expecting her to lead the merger negotiations. They inched down the aisle, the slow pace giving Claire time to reflect on the profound impact of the past few hours. She thought about how quickly she had judged Walter based on his appearance, how easily she had dismissed him as a potential nuisance. The shame of that initial reaction still burned, but it was now tempered by a deep sense of gratitude for the lesson she had learned. As they neared the exit, Claire made a split-second decision. Turning to Walter, she asked, "Would you like to share a cab into the city? I'd be happy to drop you off at your hotel." Walter's eyes crinkled with a warm smile. "That's very kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose. I'm sure you have important business to attend to." Claire felt a pang of guilt at his words. He was right, of course. She did have important business waiting. But somehow, standing there with this humble hero, the merger negotiations felt less pressing than they had just hours ago. "It's no imposition at all," she assured him. "I'd welcome the company, if you're willing." As they made their way through the terminal, Claire found herself paying more attention to their surroundings. She noticed an elderly couple struggling with their luggage and paused to offer assistance. She smiled at a harried mother trying to corral two energetic toddlers. These small acts of kindness, which she might have overlooked in her usual rush, now felt natural and necessary. In the taxi, as the Chicago skyline came into view, Claire's internal conflict intensified. Part of her was already mentally preparing for the negotiations ahead, reviewing key points and strategies. But another part, a part that had been awakened during her conversation with Walter, was questioning the very foundations of her driven, often ruthless approach to business. As the taxi wove through Chicago's bustling streets, Claire found herself stealing glances at Walter. His weathered face, etched with lines of experience, seemed to hold a serenity that she envied. Here was a man who had faced death, who had witnessed the worst of humanity, yet he exuded a calm that Claire, with all her professional success, had never achieved. "You seem troubled, Claire," Walter said softly, breaking the silence. His perceptiveness startled her. Claire sighed, realizing that her internal turmoil must be visible on her face. "I'm just thinking about work," she admitted. "This merger is crucial for my company. It could make or break my career." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Important decisions often weigh heavy on us," he said. "But may I offer a perspective from someone who's seen a bit more of life?" Claire nodded eagerly, grateful for his insight. "In my experience," Walter continued, his voice gentle but firm, "the decisions that truly matter aren't about profit margins or career advancement. They're about people. About doing what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." His words hit Claire like a physical force. She thought about the merger, about the jobs that would be lost if it went through, about the communities that would be affected. She had always viewed these as necessary sacrifices for progress, but now, seeing them through Walter's eyes, she felt a deep unease. "But how do you know what's right?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In business, in life, how do you make those choices?" Walter's eyes twinkled with a mixture of wisdom and kindness. "You listen to your heart, Claire, not the part that's afraid or greedy, but the part that knows right from wrong. It's always there, whispering to us. We just need to learn to hear it." As the taxi pulled up to Walter's hotel, Claire felt a sudden reluctance to let him go. This man, whom she had so carelessly dismissed hours ago, had become a beacon of wisdom and integrity in her life. "Walter," she said impulsively, "would you be willing to meet for coffee tomorrow? I think I could use some more of your advice." Walter smiled warmly. "I'd be delighted, Claire. Life has a funny way of bringing people together when they need it most." As she watched Walter disappear into the hotel lobby, Claire felt a profound shift within herself. The upcoming merger negotiations no longer seemed like the most important thing in her world. Instead, she found herself contemplating bigger questions about purpose, about integrity, about what truly mattered in life. With a deep breath, Claire directed the taxi driver to her own hotel. She had a lot to think about before tomorrow's meeting, and for the first time in years, she felt open to the possibility that her carefully planned career path might not be the only road to fulfillment. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Chicago's skyline. Claire, having spent a restless night wrestling with her thoughts, found herself sitting in a quiet corner of a small cafe near Walter's hotel. She had texted her team, postponing the morning's preparatory meeting. This conversation with Walter felt more important than any business dealings. As the bell above the door chimed, Claire looked up to see Walter entering the cafe. Despite his advanced years, he moved with a quiet dignity, nodding politely to the barista as he made his way to Claire's table. "Good morning, Claire," he said warmly, easing himself into the chair across from her. I hope you managed to get some rest after our long flight. Claire smiled ruefully. Not much, to be honest. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, Walter. About the things you said. And about the way I behaved when I first saw you on the plane. Walter's eyes softened with understanding. We all make mistakes, Claire. It's how we learn and grow. Taking a deep breath, Claire steeled herself for what she needed to say. Walter, I owe you a real apology, not just for moving seats, but for the judgment behind that action. I looked at you and saw only an old man who might inconvenience me. I failed to see the hero, the teacher, the human being behind that first impression. I'm truly sorry. Walter reached across the table, patting Claire's hand gently. Your apology is accepted, though it's not necessary. What's important is that you recognize the error in your thinking. That's a rare quality, Claire, and one that speaks volumes about your character. Tears pricked at the corners of Claire's eyes. Thank you, Walter. Your forgiveness means more than you know. But I think this realization goes beyond just our interaction. It's made me question a lot of things about my life, my career, my priorities. Walter nodded encouragingly, signaling for her to continue. I've always been driven, Claire explained. Always focused on the next big deal, the next promotion. But sitting here with you, after hearing your stories, it all seems so small. I'm starting to wonder if I've been chasing the wrong things all along. A knowing smile played at the corners of Walter's mouth. It's never too late to change course, Claire. Every day is a new opportunity to realign our lives with our values. Claire took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. The merger I'm here for? It would make my company a lot of money. It would probably secure my position as CEO within the year. But it would also mean closing factories, laying off workers. I've always seen that as just the cost of doing business. Now, I'm not so sure. What does your heart tell you? Walter asked softly. Claire closed her eyes, listening to that inner voice that had been drowned out by ambition for so long. When she opened them again, there was a new resolve in her gaze. It tells me that there might be a better way, a way that considers the human cost, not just the bottom line. It won't be easy, and it might mean sacrificing some of my own ambitions, but I think it's the right thing to do. Walter's face lit up with pride. That, Claire, is the mark of true leadership. Not just making the easy choices that benefit yourself, but making the hard choices that benefit others. As their conversation continued, Claire felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing the direction of her company, reevaluating her own career goals. These were monumental tasks, but for the first time in years, she felt truly aligned with her values. As they prepared to part ways, Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. Walter, I know you're here for your reunion, but I'd love to stay in touch. Your wisdom, well, I think I could use more of it in my life. Walter took the card with a warm smile. I'd like that very much, Claire, and who knows? Maybe an old veteran like me could learn a thing or two from a sharp businesswoman like yourself. They shared a laugh, the sound ringing with newfound friendship and mutual respect. As Claire watched Walter leave the cafe, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This chance encounter, born from a moment of prejudice, had blossomed into a life-changing experience. Pulling out her phone, Claire dialed her team's number. It was time to propose a new approach to the merger, one that prioritized people over profits. She knew it wouldn't be an easy sell, but as she thought of Walter's courage on that long-ago battlefield, she found her own courage growing. As she stepped out into the Chicago morning, Claire felt like a different person from the woman who had boarded that flight. She had learned the profound lesson that every person, regardless of appearance or age, has a story worth hearing, a perspective worth considering. And in opening herself to that lesson, she had found a new path forward, one guided by compassion, integrity, and a deeper understanding of what truly matters in life. The bustling city stretched out before her, full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, Claire was excited to see where this new journey would lead.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.